Hi, everyone. Welcome to Managing the School to Work Transition, the last session of it, and it's called Advocating for Yourself and Workplace Rights. So I am Lindsay Granger Weaver, one of the associate directors on the advising and programs team, and welcome. So this is, as you probably have guessed by now, part of the Beyond Barnard Summer Colloquium 2020. We're wrapping it up over these next few weeks, but you can definitely see this recording and all the rest of them on our YouTube channel. If you just Google Beyond Barnard YouTube, you'll be able to find it. But it's really great that pretty much everything this summer has been recorded so that you can access it at any point. And then the next few weeks, you'll be able to see this and all the rest of our stuff. So in today's workshop, this is the agenda. We'll start with workplace rights and then go into advocating for yourself and then advocating for your career and kind of the nuance between those two things. Some closing thoughts on both this and the series, and then some question and answer and also comments and stories, because this topic is so broad and you kind of have to approach it in a very broad brush manner that folks tend to have some very individual stories, very individual questions and comments. And so I want to leave space for you guys to be able to really share and also get some of your more pressing questions answered. So this first part about workplace rights is really divided into two buckets. So legal protections and then human resources. So employment on its face is a contract between employee and employer whose basic terms are regulated by state and federal laws. And so I wanted to start with this definition because it's really easy to think of employment as this transaction between yourself and your company, but really there's a lot more that goes into that orbit, and there are a lot of things that kind of press into that, and a lot of things that control the conditions of it. And so it's really good to keep in mind when kind of working through this, but also thinking about advocacy and thinking about rights and thinking about the things that you can actually advocate for. So legal protections really differ by state. What's legal in New York is slightly different than what's legal in New Jersey, which is probably very different than what's legal in like Texas or Utah or Mississippi or California. So it really depends on where you live, the sorts of things that employers can and can't do, and the sorts of things that you are protected under. And so two really key examples of this are ideas around the right to work and also at-will employment. So the right to work is really about unions and their right to act or not kind of act on behalf of workers in particular industries and particular states. And so for example, in like education, especially like if you want to be a teacher, the unions are really important in setting workplace standards and work environment standards, but in states where they can't unionize, those professions look very different than states that can. The same with at-will employment, which is basically means that you can separate from an employer at any time. But depending on what you're protected by in that particular state, what they can separate from you for is very different than what it could be in another place. So just keeping that in mind, that jobs look very different in different states based on these sorts of things. They're also different in between state and federal. So who is covered and protected, what is covered and protected. There's some instances where this is very different. Sometimes it's exactly the same. And depending on who the judge is at a certain time, it's whoever wins is really up to kind of that decision maker. So these are really important things to keep in mind. A little bit of homework is to look up the specifics for your state. So looking up what either job that you're currently in or that you want to be in, what the parameters are for that, so you know what you can and can't advocate for in the future. So staying on legal protections, going to federal, and this whole part is very United States focused. And so if you're calling in or if you're on this call from somewhere else or planning to work abroad, then keep these in mind as you look up the employment laws and standards in those states and in those countries rather. So federal law is pretty expansive. Some of them cover circumstances of work. So things that, things like if you're handling hazardous materials, what that should look like, or how many hours you can work before you get a break, those sorts of things. We're going to focus on the ones that cover individuals at work, because that is directly related to your rights as a human at work, and also the things that you can advocate for in terms of yourself and your career. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is really the watchdog for employment discrimination. And they basically cover your employer being able to either hire you, fire you, make your work miserable based on who you are and what sorts of identities that you have. So if you're looking at job descriptions, for example, and you see EOC, so Equal Opportunity Employer, that means that's kind of a signal that they kind of have to put that in there, that they're following the law. But then a lot of job descriptions will also add things to it, so that just to show that they may go beyond what is officially covered. And that's always nice to see, especially if you have certain identities or have some certain disabilities, just making sure that you're starting to work for somewhere that's going to protect you and you have that on paper. So this is the official definition of employment discrimination from the EEOC website. Employment discrimination is a form of discrimination based on race, gender, religion, national origin, physical or mental disability, age, sexual orientation, and gender identity by employers. So adding this official definition, all the things in yellow are things that an employer can't fire you for. So they can't fire you because they don't like your race or gender or age. Going for age discrimination, so if you're over 40, it's often a very different employment environment. And so that's where that comes in. They also can't ask you about these things or try to tease them out in an interview, because they're not things that you're legally allowed to make hiring decisions on. And just thinking about the difference between state and federal. So the last two, sexual orientation and gender identity, are actually new to federal law. There was a lot, I'm not sure if y'all follow the Supreme Court, but a few weeks ago, up until a few weeks ago, it was legal in some states to get fired for those things, but now it's nationally not okay, and that's a huge step forward. So the EEOC investigates these sorts of claims. Unfair treatment based on all of the highlighted things before, harassment based on them, things like denial of reasonable workplace change. So if you have documented disability and need accommodations, your employer is not giving you these sorts of things that you need, then that falls under this EEOC category. So trying to get you to talk about your medical history. And then also they investigate when you are retaliated against for participating in other either employment discrimination cases. So if you testify on someone's behalf or give a statement, you are protected in that way as well. And so they are really the go-to when institutional interventions fail. So that would be human resources. If they don't do it, or if you feel like they're not up to snuff, then this is kind of taking it to that next level. But we're going to talk next about HR and kind of think about where their place is in this too. So human resources really manages the circumstances of your employment. Depending on the size and scope of your organization and what industry you're in, HR is either this huge bureaucratic entity or like 5 people. And so they manage kind of all of the things that go into you being able to do your job. So benefits, compensation, like salary, perks, also workplace environmental standards, specific employment policies, things like that. So the things that may be outside of your day-to-day tasks, but definitely impact them and will be useful in understanding kind of what you can ask for, when you can ask for it, things like that. They're basically the arbiters of what is organizationally okay, and they should provide guidelines for recourse when things are not okay. So they should provide that chain of command of who to go to for what and at what points. And it's really good to keep that in mind so you're not jumping over people, because if anything, like if you do get to the point where you have to go to them for something that is beyond kind of the norm, beyond understanding your benefits or comp, for example, then you want to make sure that you're going about it the right way. So it's really important to keep in mind that they don't work for you. They work to maintain the smooth running of the organization, and that may be different than what would help you smoothly run in the organization. So really keeping in mind that they're not your personal watchdog, they're not someone who's necessary, or an organization or department that's necessarily going to always have your back. They want to keep the peace. And so knowing that nuance and knowing that distinction is really helpful in knowing like when to take things to them and what to say to them. And yeah. So if you do feel like something is happening, the first step before going to HR is to document, because they're going to want to see that things aren't a one-off, that there's maybe a pattern of behavior, a pattern of things that you're seeing that you're not okay with. And so knowing that you'll have to build a case, you really want to build it on personal drives and devices. If your job gives you a phone, or your job gives you, access to like a Google Drive or something like that, that's not where you store your notes. You really want to do that on your own devices, in your own drives, in your own email, just so that you're keeping it offline until you're ready to report. And then just like make and keep copies of everything. Hopefully you won't have to do this, but it's really good, especially if you just feel something off or see something off, just make sure that you add as much detail as you can, because these are going to be helpful in building your case and making your case for any sorts of issue you may be having. And so as I was pulling this together, I came across this very timely tweet from internet human Francesca Ramsey, who basically says, the last line of it is the key: a paper trail is your friend. So making sure that, especially in this virtual environment where you can't check in with people all the time, and you may not be able to get the sorts of clarification, it's also very common for communication to kind of be two ships passing in the night and just not really be effective. And so following up, keeping that paper trail, because that is going to help you moving forward. So we're going to pause here because that was a lot and that was also very broad. And so if you have any initial questions or comments about that first section, I'm just going to stop for a second. You can either unmute yourself or put yourself in, or ask the question in the chat, just so we can all make sure we're on the same page before we move forward. So I'm gonna take a sip of water and we can queue up some questions. Okay, so keeping in mind, there's going to be a Q&A section at the end as well. So if you want to hold till then or just want to hear more, then we can keep it moving. So this next part will be all about advocating for yourself. So the key point in advocating for yourself is to really ask for the things that you need to be successful in the job that you're doing. It can be hardware or software. So if you find yourself getting a whole bunch of files in Word, but you're using a Mac at home and all you have is Pages and the conversion is super weird, know that from experience, then you can ask for access to Microsoft Word or that Office 360 that they have. Likewise, if you need different timing, or if you need a different supervisory style or work style or workload management, to ask for those things too. It's really up to you to let your supervisor and employer know the things that you need to be successful and the things that will then make your output more successful and make the company more, an organization more successful. But they won't know unless you say something. So make sure that you're asking for needs and maybe hold off on the wants until they become needs or until you can maybe justify them. And so that really goes into this next part, which is read the room a little bit. If you're finding that your employer is having some budget issues or financial troubles or talking about being laid off, then it may not be the best time to ask for something like a new computer, but maybe they could in the budget, you know, get you faster internet, which is something that a lot of companies are doing right now. Also be prepared to show that you need it and then prove that the investment was worthwhile by, if you do get it, making sure that your output is boosted or whatever you said you needed it for, whether it's the software or even just like a workload change or something like that, just making sure that that you can show that it was worthwhile and that they didn't waste their time or money, because that's not something employers enjoy doing. So another thing that you should advocate yourself are for anything that will help you get through visible or invisible disabilities. You know, at your 504 plans, if this is something that you have to think about, documented disabilities, those plans that you had at Barnard are still very valid. It's just a matter of figuring out what is going to be a reasonable accommodation for this particular employer. It may be less than what you got at Barnard, it may be more, but just kind of keeping in mind what the limitations of your employer may be, but also know that you are absolutely entitled to what is in that plan. And also understand your benefits package. So this would be especially useful for all types of disabilities, but just in general, life circumstances change, and these may be things that you need to access that you may not have felt like you needed at the beginning. So mental health services are typically covered by insurance. And also a lot of companies have employee assistance programs or something of the like, and those are basically more acute issues. So if you suddenly become a caregiver for a relative, or there should be some sort of assistance for that. And so that's part of advocating, is to make sure that all of the circumstances, even things outside of work that may impact what you're doing during that time that you're on the clock, are covered and taken care of. So setting boundaries and negotiating are things that are tough for new employees in most circumstances, but are definitely difficult when you're starting a job during a pandemic with very high unemployment, because a lot of people feel that they have to be very open to whatever employers say, can't really negotiate for a salary because there are a whole bunch of other people without jobs who will work for maybe less, maybe not allowed to say no, or not allowed to talk about different ways to do things, because again, there's this like waiting applicant pool or talent pool out there. And I would say don't think about that too much. Employers don't like to go through hiring people. And so chances are, if you are reasonable in what you're saying no to, or reasonable with the sorts of boundaries that you're putting up, or the salary or time or non-comp perks that you negotiate for, then they should be open to at least hearing you. The worst they can say is no, but you shouldn't feel that you can't ask. The idea some people have of like, they should just be grateful to have a job, isn't going to help you in this circumstance, and it's not going to help you moving forward in your career. So it's really good to even practice these sorts of things now, so that you get more comfortable with them moving forward. And the goal here is really to just protect yourself and protect your peace. So protecting yourself physically, mentally, emotionally, all of that is really something that at any point should be a priority in your career, but especially right now when so much other things are going on, that it's very easy to get burned out. It's very easy to either throw yourself in your work and not be compensated for that extra effort, or pull yourself back and then not really do a great job because you're so burned out. And so making sure that you're okay will then help you do better at work, and then help your advocacy, because you'll show them that you're working under tough circumstances, but you want to make sure that you're successful so that they're successful. So this next part will go into advocating for your career. And so if you think of the differences being, advocating for yourself in the moment and what you need to be successful right now, versus advocating for your career, which is really keeping in mind what you'll need to have a long-term career, either with that company or most likely somewhere else. So your first job, or your first real job, or first post-college job, however you want to frame it, is just a starting point. And so really keeping your future self and your future needs in mind is going to be really useful for you to kind of put everything in perspective. Depending on who your supervisor is, they may not be thinking about kind of your progression. They're thinking about what you can do for them at this company. A good supervisor will help you out, or maybe like put you in a good position to take advantage of opportunities and take advantage of things that may progress your career, but don't expect that. And so it's really up to you to think about the things that you'll need, the things that you should ask for, because your employer's number one desire is to keep your position filled as long as possible. But yours should be to think about maybe your next step or next few steps forward. So you should think about these steps even when you're not looking to make a move. It's really tough when you're like, okay, I have to leave this job, and you start looking for new jobs and see whatever like the skill sets they're looking for or experiences that they want you to have. And you think back to being like, oh, I had the last few years to like build this up and I didn't. So now you're kind of starting and putting at a disadvantage for the move that you want to make. So it's good to really think about the steps you want to be in and kind of what place you'll want to be in the future, so that you can plan for it now. And it's not so much knowing, like mapping out a professional career, like looking for my next job title will be this, and then after that it'll be that, because that may not always be the case. And there may be some job titles that you get in the future that don't even exist right now. But you can start to think about maybe the lifestyle you want to have. If you know, for example, that your next career, so if you want to make a move in 3 years, but you want it to be something that gives you time to travel or gives you a lot higher salary, you can start to put yourself in that position to be able to be qualified for those positions, right, when you want them. And so to do this, let your goals be your guide in seeking out any sort of professional development resources. It's really good. It's something that you can either check in with your supervisor or even human resources, depending on the company, to see what sorts of funds are available. Some time off sometimes is available to do certain things. Some places will have like a budget per employee or a budget per department. And so really seeing what the parameters are can help you if you want to, say, go to conferences or take advantage of classes or TED Talks. Some companies will even pay for higher degrees and more education. And so seeing what you want to do and then seeing what's available will be helpful for you to then plan these next steps. Then also claim your accomplishments. So people aren't going to talk you up better than you talk yourself up. And so we really want to get in the habit of showing what you're doing, showing how you're progressing, because it'll be good for you to practice that skill of selling yourself, but also to show people in your network and in your organization that you're really what you're wanting to do out of your career. So if you add the highlights to somewhere like LinkedIn or on other social platforms, just to keep people in the know about what you're doing, so that if they know of opportunities, then they can reach out to you based on them, because they can see that you're moving ahead and what direction that you're moving towards. And so just a couple closing thoughts before we get to some Q&A and CNS. So advocating for yourself takes practice. It can be really awkward even with that practice. So just keep that in mind, that it may be awkward for you to sell yourself in a way that, and just any way in general, depending on who you are. And so you can practice beforehand. And when you're asking for things, also keeping in mind that the worst someone can say is no. And chances are really good that if it's something that you're asking for that's reasonable, and you make the case that it's something that will help you be more successful and therefore help the department and the organization be more successful, then the chance of you getting that is really big. Also, know your rights and responsibilities as an employee. So this goes back to the beginning of this workshop where we went into all of that legal stuff. Knowing what they can and can't do to you, knowing what you can and can't kind of expect of an employer is really helpful for then having, again, like a backstop for your advocacy. And then thinking about rocking the boat and also the consequences of said boat rocking. Thinking through when you make a case to HR, what possible things could happen, or when you report something to your supervisor, if that's the first step in the process, what could happen from that. And just, it's not to dissuade you at all from reporting things or from advocating or anything like that. It's just be aware that things may come of it, and just, know what you're getting into, but also know why you're getting into it. And sometimes rocking the boat is a really good thing. Yeah. So questions, comments, or stories? I was going to attempt to whiteboard, but that just seems like a lot. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat or unmute yourself, or comments or stories, anything about this. I'm going to quit the screen share so that we can kind of talk as humans. So anybody have questions?
Someone wrote a question in the chat.
Okay. Oh. Okay, I see the chat now. So if you are asking your supervisor for something you want or need, what is the best way to go about it? Email versus in person, or suggested phrasing. So if there is a chance that you can have in person, or whether it's in person via Zoom, that's always the best way to do it. You want to prepare for it ahead of time, depending on what you're asking for. But I think you want to do it in person so that you can have the conversation and then follow up via email with what was decided. So what sorts of things are you thinking about asking for? Or is this just broad? Oh. Okay, so yeah, so broadly asking in person at like a check-in, and when you do make the ask, just have your list of reasons why you want to, why you're asking for this thing or why you need it. And then you can say, I've been doing this work and I think that what would help me be more successful is this. And so you really want to make sure that you're showing them that it'll be mutually beneficial for them to give you this thing or allow you to do this, whatever it is, because that way it'll be easier for your supervisor if they have to justify it, to another higher up, or it makes it also show that you are keeping kind of like the company's needs in mind as well as your own. You're welcome. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
I wanted to ask how we would go about like asking for a pay raise, and like how far into after being hired it would be appropriate, and what kinds of things would make the argument stronger.
Sure. Yeah, pay raise, it's you have to make sure that that you've been there long enough to show the quality of your work. So often after you're initially hired, 6 months is a good place to kind of reassess and reevaluate how you've been, what you've been doing, what your successes have been, what sorts of things you've accomplished, and kind of justify the higher pay. And so sometimes like 6 months is kind of a good spot. If there are places before that though, that you have a spot maybe like after like a probationary period, which depending on where you're working could be 90 days, could be that 6-month period. So if there's nothing officially in place for kind of discussing your first little bit of time, then keeping that 6-month marker in your mind or on your personal calendar. And then as you prep for that, start to think about perhaps what you're doing that's above and beyond what they hired you for. So any places where you're adding value. For example, if they hired you to maybe do some basic administrative work, but you also are creating marketing materials, or running data, things like that, that weren't necessarily part of that initial hire, then those are things that you can say, I'm doing my work, I'm doing it well, but I'm also doing these other things and I feel like I could be compensated for them. And then when throwing out a number, always go higher than maybe what you want. Don't let them say, well, how much do you think that you should make more? Think like in that conversation, say, I'm wondering if I can, because of these things that I've added, because of this value I'm bringing, I'm wondering if I can get maybe a 20% pay raise, or just kind of throw something out and see what they say. And then know that that is a point for negotiation. But absolutely, if there aren't things built in saying like at a certain point they'll reevaluate, or every year they reevaluate, then 6 months beyond after hire is a good place to kind of start that conversation.
Thank you. And then I wanted to ask like how to like negotiate the initial offer, because like they always say something that's like a good number, but like it could always be higher. So like how do we go about negotiating the initial offer?
Sure. So in thinking about the initial offer, you definitely always want to counter with something higher. That's really the point of that. It's really not to take it. It's to really think like, okay, this is their offer. I'm going to say something higher. Maybe it may not get higher, but we usually meet in the middle. And so to figure that out, you can use some online salary reporting tools. So there's Glassdoor, .com, salary.com. LinkedIn has some salary insights. And you can also look at job postings that are of something comparable to that job to see what they're offering, just so that you get a ballpark of what the going rate is for that particular job within that industry, within your job market. And from there, you can then evaluate their offer to see if it's low. If you can't get that information, then you can always just ask for something that's, say, $5,000 higher, and then see if they'll meet you in the middle, or something, if they're way off base, then you can ask for something that's closer to the market rate. But it's really a matter of doing the research and kind of not being so far out of range that they think that you either don't understand the industry or aren't taking it seriously.
Okay, thank you. There's another question in the chat.
Yeah, so it's, are employers allowed to ask you your future plans in an interview? For example, I'm planning to work for about 2 years after graduation and go to grad school. Concerned that knowledge of me leaving after 2 years might affect the likelihood of hiring me. So this is a really important question, important thing to think about. They may ask you your future plans in an interview. That's not illegal, not off the table. But what you say to them doesn't necessarily have to match what you actually want to do. And so in this case, it's probably a good idea, especially if it's a position that people tend to stay in beyond those 2 years. There's some places that don't expect you to either stay in that role or stay within those organizations for that long. And so if that's the case, then you can say, like, if it's, for example, like certain teaching positions or certain education positions, or even like being a legal assistant, those are very short term for the purpose that people use them to figure out if they want to continue on with their education in these fields. if that's not true, and if it's kind of something that people tend to stay in, then you can just say that you want to work for a few years and then evaluate your options. You see perhaps graduate school in the future, maybe not give the 2-year number, but to, err to the side of honesty. Then you can say, I plan to go to grad school at some point, but I really want to work first to see, make sure it's something I want to do, and then also see if I even have to go. And so that's a common answer. They're probably won't hold you to it, but it's a way to be honest in an interview without spilling all of the tea, because then that could impact their hiring.
I have another question.
Okay.
I wanted to ask about like the difference between like a male salary and like a woman's salary. Like what happens if we're in a position where we have the same job title as like a male person and they're getting paid more?
If you have that knowledge like documented, so if you and a male colleague have compared notes and you realize that your jobs are the same, but you're not being paid what you should be paid, then you can take that either to, depending on who your supervisor is and how much you trust them, you can take that information there or take it to human resources. Gender disparities in pay are really tricky to navigate. I wouldn't necessarily take it to the EEOC right away, but it's something that you should absolutely hold on to that documentation. And if it's on paper and you kind of like checking in with that person, seeing what their tasks are, seeing like if it's exactly the same thing, then you'll have a case to go to HR, see if they can rectify the situation. And if not, then you can take it a step further. But just make sure that if it's not a rumor, that you absolutely have it on paper, and absolutely if you have the male colleagues' cooperation, get them to write down what they do, get them to kind of have in your case, kind of like in your documentation, the fact that you guys are doing the same thing, because that's always the argument, is that, well, it's not the same job or they're doing something slightly different. But if they're willing to go to bat for you and say, no, this is the same job and I'm making more for it, then that will be more helpful than just kind of saying it without having that person back you up.
Thank you.
Yeah. These are really great questions in the chat and in person, but any others, any stories or anything like that? I really appreciate you guys sharing and asking these. It's really helpful, especially gender-based pay is kind of the next big frontier. And so hopefully gender-based pay, racialized gender-based pay, the next time we do this workshop, we can say, oh, there's none of that, or here's some concrete tips, because we can actually start to figure out how to fight these things.
I don't have any more questions, but I wanted to thank you for your time.
Oh yeah, very welcome. Thanks for your time. Thanks for popping in. All right, so if that is it, then thank you so much for coming. These slides will be in, you're welcome. These slides will, you'll receive them in the follow-up, and this will be on YouTube in a few weeks. So thanks a lot, I appreciate it.